Welcome to the Art of Wargaming Military Philosophy series. I am your host, Yaga Malark. In this video, we will be discussing agency theory and how it can be applied to military science and wargaming. Now, before we get started, we wanted to clarify that the agency theory that we're discussing is not the business concept, but rather the framework developed by a scholar of religion to explain the origin of myth. Real quick before we get started, I just wanted to say that the Art of Wargaming does not take a stance on religion in any way, and that we are merely attempting to use these concepts to explain similar situations within history and military science. This is in no way a criticism of theism or atheism. A quick addition before we begin. For those of you who don't know me, who don't listen to the show, I am Yaga Malark. I do a podcast on military science and how it can be applied to modern wargaming. My background in this is having studied military science for a long time in my life, but this particular video draws from my experience as a religious studies scholar. So when we're talking about this, I'm going to kind of move from philosophy to religion, from different theory to theory, and also on the show we discuss physical and intellectual wargaming. So for like physical wargaming, think stuff like the SCA or Belagarth, stuff where there's actual physical combat involved. Intellectual wargaming would be stuff like Warhammer 40k, or even chess. Chess would also count for it. So I'm going to move also back and forth between those concepts, so be prepared. And then lastly, I feel like I should define the word agency, because it can mean a couple of different things in different concepts. Here, when we're talking about agency, we're talking about action. We're talking about an intelligent, individual creature making a decision and acting. So that is the agency that we're speaking of going forward. Agency theory is first observed in mythology as a response to unexplained natural phenomena. Take lightning, for example. The ancient peoples would have had no way of knowing that lightning was caused by an electrical imbalance and therefore discharge between the clouds and the ground. All they would have seen was the sheer power of nature, raw and pure. Lacking the understanding that science would later provide, they assigned divine agency to what they saw. Gods like Thor and Zeus were used in place of actual scientific understanding in order to better explain what they were looking at, and to them were assigned motives and personalities in order to make them more human and therefore more reachable and understandable. This was done in mythologies all around the world in order to explain natural phenomenon and moral qualities that weren't really able to be explained otherwise. But why do humans do this? Putting aside for a moment our personal beliefs about the divine, how is it that humans often seem to rush to the conclusion that a god or other intelligent external force is behind whatever phenomenon that we can't otherwise explain? To answer this, we need to go back before the agricultural revolution, to when we were really just another animal in the bush. We are the same, physiologically speaking, as our ancestors who lived in small family units of hunter-gatherers. The instincts and intelligence that kept us alive back then are still present in our modern brains. One of these instincts includes our innate threat reaction, characterized by a rush of adrenaline to the bloodstream that helps us perform better in high-stress situations. Now imagine yourself walking through the jungle, armed only with your wits and perhaps a simple weapon. As you go, a patch of grass rustles nearby. Let's say that this could be caused by one of two sources. The first source would be a source without agency, so a gust of wind or a dropping pine cone making the grass rustle a little bit. The second would be a source with agency, which is to say, at best, a harmless herbivore, and at worst, a stalking predator. Now, before we actually know the source of the sound, we typically make a split-second decision on what it is. If we assume that the source of the sound is without agency, then we continue on our merry way, perhaps more aware of dropping pine cones. But if we assume that the source comes with agency, we become far more alert, and we direct our focus to assessing the potential threat. After all, it is good to know whether or not you're being stalked by a squirrel or a saber-toothed tiger. Now, if our initial assumption is that the rustling in the grass is caused by a squirrel or a gust of wind or something else completely harmless, but it turns out to be a predator or some other threat, well, then we're in a lot of trouble and potentially lunch. But if we assume in the first place that it was a threat, but it turns out to be nothing at all, Well, we're a little frazzled and have to come down off of an adrenal reaction, but otherwise we're fine to continue on our merry way. So, it would seem that it is better to assume that the rustling in the grass is caused by some sort of hostile agency and act accordingly. This same knee-jerk reaction plays out in modern society. Well, it can play out in modern society as some hyper-awareness or anxiety, even though these emotions and this instinct had a very real application in a state of nature. Taking this assumption that natural phenomena are caused by something with agency, we can then broaden this assumption to encompass other things that we don't cleanly understand. Let us go back to our example of lightning. It is better to assume that it is caused by an entity that can be predicted and reasoned with. Things, though, that go bump in the night, well, we assume that they're caused by some sort of malicious force. Better to err on the side of caution and just sort of react to things as though they're caused by some sort of foreign intelligence. This same concept can be applied to military science. We assume that there is some agency behind what happens on the field of battle, that our opponent or some other external force is in control of the factors and results that we are not. Soldiers throughout history have used lucky rituals, clothing, and weapons that they believed kept them safe in the field of battle. Those of you that play Warhammer will know that there are countless superstitions regarding dice rolls, from switching out dice when you're trying to do a reroll to the outright supplication of dice gods. None of these activities are statistically proven to make a lick of difference, and yet we participate in them anyways for the comfort of it. We see this tendency play out in a number of ways. In war, it is natural for us to try to predict our enemy's thought process, for us to understand their reasoning so that we can then work around it to achieve victory. However, this is often done with the subconscious assumption that our opponent thinks as we do, has a clear and recognizable agenda to us, and is trained to react and act in the same manner that we are. And this may be quite effective in areas where the theories on wargaming and war are consistent. Think of a good portion of European military history, where you had folks that were working with similar cultural foundations, the same writings of philosophers on the subject, and the same kind of moral structures. They assumed that war would be done the same everywhere as it was done amongst them. This assumption was shattered, however, upon meeting foes who either had better technological advances, who had strategies that were better, or who just acted in a different fashion in war. Another fallacious assumption of agency lies in the way that we watch plans play out on the field. When we read history, in particular the descriptions of battles, it can be easy to think that the events had to play out the way that they did, as though fate or some omnipotent general were in charge. This assumption also comes with the idea that the battle could have only been won in one particular way, and that the winning side was the one that chose that particular strategy. But the truth of war and of battle is far more chaotic. Even the best plan cannot account for every factor in war. There are some things that a general does have control over: the quality of the training and practice before the action, the availability of equipment and good units during the action, the systems of communication that have been put into place, and of course the theories that are being applied. These one-sided activities are within the control of either commander, respectively, but how these particular factors play out on the battlefield can never truly be predicted. We can try to expand our studies and our experience to incorporate very many things, but we can never truly understand the mind of our opponent. And in fact, it's very dangerous if we think we can. The final fallacious assumption of agency that we will discuss is that of uniform action. As we talked about before, despite whatever training and practice goes into it, battle is ultimately chaos. Individual fighters or units are kind of fighting the best that they can in their sectors, hopefully supporting the rest of the team. But sometimes a maneuver fails despite overwhelming superiority. Why? In part, this is because even members of the same team, even teams that are very well practiced and work well together, cannot always predict what their teammates are going to do, in particular when they're dealing with situations that they haven't dealt with before. Oftentimes in battle, victory is decided by units and fighters acting independently of one another, but just sort of reacting based on the rest of their team and what their enemy is doing. Each element is individually assessing the danger of their immediate situation, and thusly may fail to act in a way that benefits the whole team because they cannot see the big picture. Good planning, diligent training, proper equipment, and a study of our opponent go a long way toward increasing our probabilities of victory. But however, they cannot account for all factors and do not guarantee us victory. Flexibility in our battle plan is called for not just because things might go wrong, but because they will go wrong. Sometimes the rustling bush is a predator. Sometimes the sword falls exactly where we intend it to. Sometimes our opponent acts in a way that we predict and we are able to beat them reliably. But sometimes it's just the wind.